Now that we've located our meninges of the spinal cord, let's go ahead and look at the spinal cord itself and the structures we need to identify there. So to review from the previous video, we know our gray matter is going to be the deeper matter that we see here, creating this kind of butterfly shape. White matter in the spinal cord is more external, it's more superficial. So everything else we see in this image is going to be white matter of the spinal cord. So let's focus in on that gray matter. And I've written a couple notes here for how to orient yourselves. So when you're looking down at your model, you will have a little extra information besides the spinal cord cross-section. We can't forget about our vertebrae. So the spinal cord runs through our vertebrae. That's very important. We learned that in the skeletal unit. So I have labeled the body of the vertebrae here. You can use this to orient yourself to your anterior versus your posterior sides. So towards the body is going to be more anterior. Sometimes you'll see the term ventral. And then away from the spinal cord towards the spinous process is going to be our posterior side or our dorsal side. So this is another area where students get tripped up, is they mix up their anterior versus dorsal. Don't do that. Use that body to help you. This is an easy way to orient yourself. So do this before you try to answer any question involving this model. We're going to zoom in now on that area of gray matter. And we have to talk about horns. So there are 3 horns we need to know. So I'm going to number them here. Horn number 1 is going to be our posterior horn, which makes sense because it's going to be more towards our posterior side of the spinal cord. These posterior horns also look the pointiest to me. They look the most horn-like. And their function is to receive sensory info. So we're going to have info coming in from our sensory receptors. It's going to travel to the spinal cord before this information goes up to the brain for processing. So that's going to happen at the area of number 1. Next up, we have our lateral horns. So those are going to be at the number 2 here. These are easily confused with our anterior horns, but the way to know lateral horn is it's going to be the most laterally projecting part of our gray matter. So number 2 makes sense. Anterior horns are the most rounded of the bunch, and they're also the most anterior. So we're sensing a pattern here. So this region here is our anterior horn. These are kind of opposite of our posterior horns, so the anterior horn is going to be sending out motor information. So basically we've got, I'm not going to draw a brain here, but I'll write it out. So from the brain, we're going to be sending out motor information. That's going to go to our anterior horns. From somewhere below in the body, with our receptors, we're going to be generating sensory information, and this has to get back to the brain through our spinal cord. So posterior horns are going to be receiving that sensory information before it goes to the brain. So that's how we can connect these concepts. There's an additional region here in the middle. This is going to be our central commissure. So a lot of M's and a lot of S's in this word. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as the gray commissure. And in the middle of that, we have our central canal. And the interesting thing about our central canal is that it is containing cerebrospinal fluid, so our CSF. So all of that fluid is contained with this canal, which is going to be continuous with some structures we see in the brain. So that was all gray matter. Zoom out here. So let's look at white matter now, everything else that we can see here. So there is another way we can identify the anterior versus posterior side of the spinal cord in addition to the presence of the body of the vertebrae. So this technique will be useful when you're looking at microscope slides. We have on this spinal cord a deeper depression here and a shallower depression. The deeper depression is called a fissure. Specifically, it's going to be our anterior median fissure. On the posterior side, we have the posterior median sulcus. So a sulcus is a type of groove. It's not as extreme as a fissure. So when you're looking at a microscope slide and you don't have the vertebrae to orient yourself, find your median fissure and find your median sulcus. And that's going to tell you anterior versus posterior. That's really important to know because, again, students can get mixed up when they don't have the context of the vertebrae here. So that's really good information for a microscope question. In addition, we have some columns, and these are a little trickier to visualize, but we're going to do our best here. Spinal cord columns are white matter. So if you think about the structure of the spinal cord, it's traveling from the brain all the way down to like the level of the lumbosacral region. That is a column of tissue. When we're talking about white matter, we're dealing with axons. So we've got these columns of axons that are basically being chopped in half by this cross section here. So for example, we would have a lateral column here, and it would be going up towards the brain. So we can kind of add some dimension to that. This is our column. That'd be a lateral column. We're going to have an anterior and a posterior column as well. So these are going to be containing motor and sensory structures specifically. However, because they are harder to identify on here, they're less likely to be lab exam questions. So theoretically, if I put an arrow on this area here, we would know that's where we would expect to find our anterior column going up and down like this. But because that is hard to visualize, I'm not going to ask it. Other things we can see are going to be our roots. So we need to zoom out again here. So we have been just throwing around these terms, afferent and efferent. That information is going to come back now when we talk about our roots of the spinal cord. So let's orient ourselves first. This is a really deep fissure here. So this tells us this is going to be our anterior side. Other side will be posterior. So notice I orient myself before I try to identify anything here, and that's what I want you guys to do on the lab exam. So posteriorly or dorsally, we're going to have a dorsal root. And this is connected to that posterior gray horn. So we've got little nerve fibers here conjoining into our dorsal root. On the dorsal root, we have an enlargement. This is our dorsal root ganglion. So this is the first time we've seen that term ganglia pop up again. Ganglion for singular. So to recall, a ganglion is going to be a group of neuron cell bodies. So in this area, we have our neuron cell bodies. And then these strands here are going to be our axons. Many, many fibers of neuron axons. So that's going to be dorsal root and dorsal root ganglion. More anteriorly, we have our ventral root. So it's going to be this guy here. No ganglion associated with the ventral root. So when you find your ganglion on your model, that is a good hint that you're talking about the posterior spinal cord, because only the dorsal root has an associated ganglion. Now these two areas, we continue our lines here, they are going to conjoin to form a spinal nerve. So when you think about it, our spinal nerves are sending out information and they're also receiving information from the brain. So we need two pathways. We need a dorsal pathway and a ventral pathway. And let's explain what information is coming from both of these. So our dorsal roots are going to have sensory information. This is sensory information taken from receptors through the spinal cord back to the brain. Anteriorly, with our ventral roots, we're dealing with motor information. So this is going to be direction sent from our brain through the spinal cord to the target organs, which are often our skeletal muscles. And so that's what's going on at the level of the spinal nerve, is we have those two sources or flows of information joining so that we have a functioning spinal nerve. Anytime we have information sending out, we have to have a way to bring it back to that central nervous system. A couple other things we can see. So we have to draw a little bit here. Basically, the spinal cord is this conjunction here. Spinal cord is actually going to split again, which we might have. Oh, here we go. So this is that same diagram. We have our ventral roots and our dorsal roots, same position. So what's happening with the spinal cord is we've got our dorsal root and our ventral root forming our spinal nerve, this conjunction here, which is then going to split off again. So it's going to split into a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. And so at this point, notice the color here. Dorsal root is blue, ventral root is red. So at the level of the spinal nerve, we're getting both types of information, and this will continue as the spinal nerve splits off into the ramus. We still have both types of information going dorsally and both types being sent to the anterior part of the body. Okay, I know this is a confusing concept for students, so use this image, make sure you understand what types of information are coming off the posterior spinal cord and the dorsal root versus the anterior and the ventral root counterpart. And then we're going to tie all of this information together with just a little conversation about reflex arcs. So a reflex arc is automatic. We don't consciously control our reflexes. It's an automatic response to a stimulus without conscious thought or conscious control. And oftentimes, these things are really fast. So they're happening at the level of the spinal cord, where we have a response to a stimuli before the brain can even process that input. So they're really, really quick. Sometimes we'll see the term spinal reflex, because this information and this reflex happens so fast that the brain doesn't have time to process it. So if you've ever accidentally touched something that was extremely hot and your hand jerks away immediately before you even have time to think about it, that is an example of a reflex arc. We have two types. We have monosynaptic reflex arcs, and then we're going to have polysynaptic. So let's break these words down. Mono means one. So we're dealing with one synapse. Poly is many. So we can have many, or this also just means more than one synapse. Now, I know in lecture we talk about synapses, but just to review, a synapse is going to be where the axon of one neuron is interfacing with the dendrites of a second neuron. So the synapse is kind of this whole region of exchange here. So when we have a monosynaptic reflex, that means there's just one synapse. And all of this is going to happen on the level of the spinal cord with these structures that we just talked about. So in the example, if we use that pain reflex, that is an example of a polysynaptic reflex. So I know I'm throwing these words around. Just bear with me as we draw on this spinal cord, and then hopefully it'll make a little more sense. So basically, we're going to have sensory information. So we're going to have a receptor of some sort in the body that is generating sensory information. This information is going to travel to the spinal cord. So let's draw our arrow here. It's going to go along dorsal root ganglion to the dorsal root. Technically, there would be a neuron cell body here, but we're not going to get that complicated. So we have sensory information entering along the axon of a neuron to that first posterior horn. Here, we're going to have what's called an interneuron. So I mentioned that on the previous video. The interneuron is a connecting piece. It's a connecting neuron that helps to relay information from neuron 1 through the interneuron to neuron 3. And in the case of this pain reflex, because it's polysynaptic, we're going to see that interneuron. So that's going to happen kind of within the gray matter of our spinal cord. So that is our interneuron in blue. And then lastly, we have neuron number 3. So this is going to be starting kind of in that anterior gray horn, sending information out through to the brain. There are a couple other steps involved here. So if you take neuroanatomy, you'll learn a lot more about reflex arcs, but just want to talk about the main structures involved here. So to review, we had neuron number 1, taking sensory information to our spinal cord. We're going to have our interneuron number 2, which is that connecting piece within the gray matter of the spinal cord. And then after we have some processing here, there's going to be a response sent out through that ventral root. And in this case, this is going to be our motor information. So we're sending out a motor response that tells us, take the hand away from the heat source. We're moving the muscles with that reflex. So that's how polysynaptic reflexes work. Monosynaptic is simpler. So all we have to do is take out this connecting piece, the interneuron. So in the case of a monosynaptic reflex, it's just one synapse, one connecting point here, because we only have the sensory information going through one neuron and then the motor information leaving with another one. Okay, so hopefully that has helped to make reflex arcs a little simpler. Let's finish off by talking about what to emphasize for the lab exam. So this reflex arc stuff is really good to know. Basically, if you understand reflex arcs and you understand what's happening with information traveling through the dorsal and the ventral roots and the gray matter, you're going to be fine with identifying structures on the lab exam, because reflex arcs involve all of the structures that we identified up here. I would emphasize this image. We're going to have a model like this where you're identifying things from this cross section here. I would study roots and spinal nerves, but nothing beyond that. So don't worry about the rami that we talked about. But definitely everything in this central view is fair game. We do have our meninges and our epidural space. We also can see our roots from this perspective. So we've got dorsal root going into our dorsal root ganglion, and that smaller, more anterior counterpart is going to be the ventral root. So all of the things we talk about structure-wise can be seen from this image. Like we saw in the histology video, you can also expect to see these under a microscope. In that case, we're not going to have the entire model here. We'll just be looking at this section, this cross section of the spinal cord. So you're not going to have this extra context here to help you orient yourself. You're going to have to use that sulcus and fissure relationship. Okay, and that's pretty much everything I could ask. So I know this was a lot. I hope this has helped you to understand reflex arcs a little better. But if these are still confusing for you, don't worry too much about it. I would focus more on images like this and just basic structure identification.